just firstly to say how wonderful it is to see this culmination of the exhibition that I know that the team here has been planning so long, and to see so many incredible objects on display here, some of which have been part of my life over the 12 years that I was working here. Kate asked me if I would just set the scene a little bit in terms of talking about why Lucie Rie was so important for the collection. And I was chatting to Helen over lunch. Those of you who can remember back to Helen's brilliant talk about Albion Muse might remember that first photograph of the studio. And in the foreground of that image, where today we might see a laptop or an iPad or an iPhone, there was a typewriter, a manual typewriter. And that just stuck with me, because one of the things that for me was really precious when I was researching the collection years and years ago was discovering a letter written in, I think, 1981 from a guy called Mike Hill, who at the time was museums officer for Cleveland County. And it had been typed by the local typing pool, and we had the duplicate, and it started, "Dear Lucie Rice, we would love to acquire one of your works for our collection." And it went on to explain a little bit more that within the local art college, they had a small collection of about 6 pieces of studio pottery, which previously it seems had been part of a larger decorative arts collection, but they were now looking to make this a formal studio pottery collection for a new art gallery that they had planned. That gallery possibly being the Cleveland Craft Centre, or possibly being one of the other galleries that eventually led up to this wonderful building that we're in now. Lucie Rie responded and said, "Yes, come on this date at this time." And that was it. And I thought this wonderfully curt letter typed on that typewriter that we saw, was that because he'd called her Lucie Rice? Or was it, as Helen, I think, really articulated, that she worked in had such a regimented life that he had that slot, there was no messing about, that's when he was to come. I'm not sure which piece was acquired. I think it was either of these 2 bottles here, but I'm not 100% sure. But I think it's worth noting that with that letter and with that purchase, it effectively established the studio pottery collection for Middlesbrough. And I think it's probably fair to say that Lucie will have been the first female potter to have been acquired by that collection. So really foundational in establishing the collection and in enabling what we have here today. When I was thinking about that brief of asking about what my favourite piece was, I had a couple of ideas of things I wanted to talk about. One of them was under the general title of Pots Not About Pots. The other was around the subject of hard edges. I'm going to try and miraculously combine those 2 things into one in the 7 minutes I've got remaining. And I'm going to focus on this tiny piece just here as we go through that discussion. Pots not about pots, though, as a starting point. If we think about Bernard Leach, he was making pots that were about his perception, his take on Japanese folk pottery. If we think about Charles and Nell Weiss, they were making pots about ancient Korean pottery. If we think about Reginald Wells making pots about ancient Chinese pottery, or Michael Cardew making pots about the West Country slipware pottery traditions. In many ways, what's interesting about Lucie Rie is she's breaking from that tradition of pots about another pottery making tradition. Look at this piece here, and that glorious manganese glaze that becomes so characteristic of Lucie Rie. You can see it across these display cases. It's talking about bronze. It's showing something. It's not to say that these objects are without precedent in the ceramic world, but she's not looking to ape or recreate or reintegrate a different ancient ceramic tradition. She's looking at a whole range of other references. In this instance, I think definitely that sense of metalwork is really important. I think Helen has said so much of what I wanted to say already in your talk around Albion Muse, in terms of some of those other influences that were so important to Lucie Rie, architecture being one of the key facets. There's another piece in the collection which I think must be in one of the display cases upstairs, which dates from the 1960s, and you could actually see an image in one of the last slides that you showed of a very similar piece, which is not the kind of organic flowing pieces that we see here so often, but quite a rigid, dramatic architectural piece. It actually was made in 1964, and its silhouette is almost identical to the Seattle Space Needle, which had been built in 1962. So the sense that there's this interplay with architecture in Lucie Rie's work, it seems really important. The idea that she was so inspired by fashion and the relationships that she had with the fashion designer Issey Miyake comes across through her work. The work is about painting. When I look at Lucie Rie's, I want to see them not necessarily in the context of other people in the studio ceramic tradition. My dream has always been to see Lucie Rie next to an Agnes Martin painting or an Anne Truitt sculpture. In fact, I will let you in on a secret. When I worked here, we had an exhibition of drawings which included a wonderful canvas by Agnes Martin with those thin, trembling lines. And we'd installed it. It was a Tate exhibition. The day before the show was open, I brought a plinth out, stuck it next to the Agnes Martin, and placed the Lucie Rie pot that is just through there with the bronze rim and the tiny lines through, and indulged in that moment of Agnes Martin and Lucie Rie together. It's such a shame that nobody else could have seen it, but it was wonderfully indulgent, and I hope one day we do see her work recontextualized in that way. Lucie Rie was not the first of those artists to look at pots that are not about pots. In fact, there's a much quoted letter from Catherine Pleydell-Boothery, one of Bernard Leach's students, sent to Bernard Leach, which I will paraphrase, in which she says, when I want people to look at my pottery, I don't want them to think of the Chinese or the Korean. I want them to think of pebbles and eggs. I want them to think of what will work best with flowers. Because that's what they seem to be for. I'm paraphrasing, but she's trying to take it out into a different direction. And in some ways, reinforcing that sense of the feminine pot also being about the organic and the natural. And her work, Catherine Pleydell-Boothery's work, very much has that organic quality to it. We're going to hear more about some of Lucie Rie's relationships to nature later on this afternoon. But I think it's also worth reflecting on some of the hardness in Lucie Rie's work. Look at the line on this particular pot here. The edge is sharp. The walls are very thin, the thing that apparently Bernard Leach hated about them so much. They're not the curved stoneware, rounded stoneware lips and bellies of a Bernard Leach pot. They're straight lines, sharp edges, the feeling of being brittle somehow. And even the mode of decoration, this sgraffito, scratched in, and what one could almost interpret as a kind of violent gesture, cutting through the clay itself. So yes, we will see wonderful examples of her work as we move through that has that organic feel, that has that rounded lip. But let's also pay attention to some of the hardness in her work. She was a tough lady. I think we've been able to recognize through some of the talks that we've heard before. And that toughness and that beauty is combined perfectly in so many of the works here. But this one, I think for me, says it all. I think that's my 10 minutes.
I was asked if I'd come and just do a little brief talk as a practitioner, because I'm a ceramicist. My name's Carol Newmarch. I live in Middlesbrough. I was brought up in Middlesbrough. And could I choose one piece that I would talk about? And I just thought, how am I going to choose one piece from this fantastic exhibition? The first time I walked through the doors to this exhibition, I literally burst into tears because Lucie Rie was such a prominent influence on me when I was learning to make pots back in the late 70s. And to see this amazing exhibition with so many examples of her work right across her lifetime. I've never seen an exhibition quite so fabulous of her work, and I think we're really privileged to have this in Middlesbrough, and I'm really excited that it's here. So when I came to choose a pot, I thought I would choose this one, and the reason I'm choosing that one is because when I was learning to make pots back in the day in Middlesex Polytechnic, where I was at the time, now university, I was determined I was going to make pots like this, and it's really difficult. And I remember spending hours upon hours learning how to make these tall vases and how to get the neck so narrow, and yet what's really difficult about this quite difficult technical thing to do is to do that and remain so fluid. And if you come and have another look at this pot later on, if you haven't already, you know, you can see that the rim is actually almost on the point of collapse, really. And to be able to have the skills to throw a piece which is so bellied out and then actually has such a narrow neck, and then this nice rim, and then for it not to just be in a heap on the wheel is quite a big deal, really. And I spent a little bit of time drawing this pot a couple of weeks ago because MIMA organised a lovely workshop where we did some drawings and then we did some printmaking. And I chose to draw this one, and as I was drawing it, people kept coming and asking me, how was it made and what was it and how did you get these lines on? So I thought I'd describe a little bit, because it is written down, but I think unless you really understand ceramics, it's quite hard to get what that is. So this is made out of two different kinds of clay mixed together, or two clays once they've been stained. So these lovely colours and these lovely lines are all incidental to the form of the wheel. And so I think this is really a celebration of wheelware, in that the texture, it's coming from the actual glaze that she's put on top, but the actual form itself and the colour that's in it is put into the form. The other thing that I love about it is the fact that when you look at it from here, it's actually slightly flattened. And there was reference to Liz Fritch's work in the earlier talk we listened to. That notion of having something that looks round but actually isn't quite round. I love that. I love the fact that it's playing with optical illusion a little bit, and that actually the more you walk around the pot, if you walk right around it, it looks different from every angle, even though it's ostensibly a pot from a distance, it looks like a round one. I love that. The other thing that's amazing, and I've seen a few friendly faces in here that have come to my pottery classes. You know how difficult it is to make pots sometimes that look great. And the thing about makes her work even more amazing to me is that she raw glazed absolutely everything. And I don't know if everybody knows what that means, but it means that the clay is not once fired. It's not once fired first and then glazed and then fired again. She put the glaze on what is essentially a material that can just melt back down to mud if you're not careful. So I think that also has a bearing on this pot, because there's an integration of the glaze and the colour that she's put into the body and the body itself, which is actually an incredibly technical, difficult thing to do and still to remain so fluid. So this is why this pot is I think the one I would pick out as my favourite iconic piece. The other thing that for me is very personal is that I was privileged. I was saying earlier on when I was having lunch, I don't have many regrets in life, but my big regret was not going to see Lucie Rie. Because I worked in the studio in Camden Town, I had a group of fellow potters, we worked together, and LB Muse wasn't very far away really, and I daren't go and see her because I was so in awe of her work. And I thought, she won't want to see me, it would just be too scary. And I really wish I had gone to see her. But when she died, I did go to the Bonhams exhibition where they sold all of the work off, which was in her personal studio. And it was such a privileged thing to do, it felt, to go and sit in this auction room. But because we were there potentially as buyers, and I did think I might be able to buy something because some of the catalogue prices were quite gettable really at that point. Only for 2 minutes, because as soon as they started bidding, they rocketed. I sat on my hands very quickly. But I had a young child who is also called Lucy, and she's called Lucy, spelled I-E. And the reason she's spelled I-E is because that's how Lucie Rie is spelled. And I really wanted some little nod to how influential Lucie Rie has been on me. I told Eleanor this, and she said that was a very fangirl thing to do. And that was fine. But I took Lucy to the show. Because we were potential buyers, we could handle all the work, which was amazing. So there was a pot very like this one. It wasn't this one, but it was very similar, just on a plinth, and the handler let us come and pick it up, and I gave it to Lucie to cradle, and I remember her standing holding this and saying, "This is who you're named for," you know, and I really wanted her to have that experience. And it was something that she does remember. And also remembering David Attenborough, who was the person who chaired that whole thing and talked about her first, and loved the fact that my Lucie had a little kind of puppet that we kept her occupied with, which was a bird that we'd got from Hamleys or something. So this, when I saw this pot, all of those memories flooded back, the memories about, you know, the integration of my own work with finding myself in the middle of all this, not just emulating her and copying her, but that kind of sense of real inspiration for working with clay in a situation which I can't imagine was harder. You know, to have to left her home, to have reset up in a foreign country, to then re-establish herself as such an amazing artist, as a woman in that time, even harder. And so just from the point of view of her being an inspirational person, I think her work for me has always had a huge significance. And I think this pot says it all really. Fragile, but robust, symmetrical but asymmetrical, beautiful, and substantial for all its substantial for all its fragility.
I feel like I have cheated slightly. I was asked to choose one piece, and I've chosen, I don't know how many are here, but there's a lot. If you haven't had a chance to look at these buttons yet, I would urge you to do, because they are incredible. And I think they are my favourite piece holistically. I'm going to describe them as one piece now, because they're so sculptural. And I thought I'd give a brief introduction to my practice first. Also, my name's Aphra. I don't think we got that first. Hi. I am a ceramic sculptor, and I create very, very different work from Lucie Rie, but it's the buttons, I think, that tie our work together. She was making these pieces during, I don't know if you've had a chance to read the descriptions as well, but she was making these during World War II. So she came over. She didn't really get much recognition at the beginning. All her pieces in Vienna were cracked when she came, which must have been absolutely horrible. As a person who packs ceramics, I know how disgusting that is, to open up the suitcase and find the shards. But when she was starting out again, she had this relationship with Fritz Lamp, who ran Bimini, or as it was later known, Orplid, which was a design studio. And there's a really lovely quote in Emmanuel Cooper's book about Lucie Rie, and was talking about their personal relationship, Lamp and Rie's, which was a hidden affair. So during this point, she was starting out again, but she was working with her lover. So it's kind of bittersweet that she didn't really have the chance to make the work she was wanting to make at that time. But then she was also working alongside her lover, so it must have been quite an interesting balance, or a juxtaposition, if you will. So there's another quote that I was reading about her actual button exhibition in the Centre for Contemporary, the one in York, Cocker. And it's classed as the cabbage years. She classes herself as working through the cabbage years during this period. And I think that's something quite important. As an artist who was working through COVID very recently, that kind of stagnating. So she's creating these works as a way of filling the gaps in between making the vessels. But in these pieces, she's actually creating some pretty unique glazes, and she was making these pieces for places like Harrods and bigger design fashion houses. And she said that she could colour match to any fabric, so I think that's quite a bold claim. I also thought I'd do a bit of a show and tell vibe, because it's nice to actually see some things up close. So these are some of the buttons that I've been making. If I give you them, you pass them around. Been making these buttons for the MIMA workshop that we did in December, so the art and social event. And I was asked to make a workshop based around Lucie Rie, and the first thing I thought of was buttons. I want to make something that you can handle, that people can get a really good feel for. So I created some plaster molds, which she does work with in the end, but she's not really a big fan of plaster, which is fine. She normally wheel throws these or hand builds them. But she goes into hospital at some point, and one of her assistants makes some plaster molds for her while she's away. And I think she probably comes back a bit groggy from being in hospital and also pretty pissed off that she's had these things made for her. But in the end, she realizes just how easy it is. And I think at the height, there was about 6,000 buttons a month, which is quite a lot. So also plaster for anyone. I'm just going to use you as a, there we go, thank you. So the plaster buttons, the plaster molds, mean that she can make a lot more of these forms. But if you actually have a look at some of the details, a lot of it is labor intensive. So 6,000 buttons a month, she had a few, maybe 15, 18 assistants, still a lot of work. And to have everything so unique, have all the colors so unique, and a lot of the colors and the surface decoration that you see in her later works, I think these were kind of test pieces for that. So there's quite a lot of sgraffito in these, which is using a pin to kind of draw across the surface. I think there's actually some evidence of that in the videos in there. So at this point, she's making 6,000 buttons a month. She's got a workshop in Holburne Museum full of, or the Button Factory, as it was called, full of assistants. And I hope that there's some kind of positivity coming out of this, because there's a lot going on in her personal life. There's a world war going on. And she's also not making the stuff that she really wants to be making, but this is kind of a stepping stone, I think. So as well as me talking about the fact that these buttons are very sculptural, and I have a nice relationship with that, I think it's her perseverance and the way she kind of worked through this unprecedented times, with an affair that was never really disclosed, making stuff she didn't really want to make, but it made everything kind of work in the end. And it's a positive message, and I think reading about that has kind of made me feel good about the stuff that I've been making. So it's, yeah, it's very interesting to get so much depth out of something so small. But I think that's it. I think I'm done. Yeah.
Thank you.